Imagine sitting in the darkest, coldest corner of a lavish ballroom. Your stepsister stands on a brightly lit stage in a $15,000 gown, gripping the microphone. She looks right at you and tells 200 of the city's most elite guests that you are a pathetic, unstable burden. She tells the crowd, she is nothing without our family. The music stops. The room goes dead silent. 200 pairs of eyes turn to judge you. But you don't cry. You don't run away. Because what the arrogant bride doesn't know is that the wealthy, principled groom standing right next to her has already uncovered her darkest, most unforgivable secret. And in exactly 5 seconds, he is going to take that microphone, expose her federal crimes to the entire room, and cancel the wedding on the spot. This is a story about the absolute power of knowing your own worth, and proof that the truth will always outlive the loudest lies told by toxic family members. If you have ever had to walk away from people who share your blood just to protect your own sanity, hit that like button right now. Share your own survival story in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life lessons on reclaiming your dignity. The heavy, gold-foiled envelope felt entirely out of place resting on the olive drab canvas of my military cot. The fluorescent lights of the barracks at Fort Bragg buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare on the calligraphy spelling out my name, Eleanor Vance. They had misspelled it. Again, I traced the rough pad of my thumb over the elegant, incorrect letters. In my world, the world of an active duty combat, medic a misspelled name on a medical manifest or a dog tag meant a catastrophic failure. In the world of my stepmother, Margaret, and her daughter, Chloe, a misspelled name on a wedding invitation was simply a calculated, quiet reminder of my exact place in the family hierarchy, an afterthought. I was 28 years old, a captain in the United States Army, and a veteran of 3 overseas deployments. I had held the lives of bleeding soldiers in my hands while mortar shells shook the earth beneath us. Yet, holding this piece of cardstock, I could feel the familiar, suffocating grip of my childhood trying to drag me backward. I was 9 years old when my father, Arthur, married Margaret. From that day forward, I was systematically erased. My achievements buried under Chloe's curated pageants, her expensive degrees, and her relentless need to be the sole center of the universe. My phone vibrated against the metal locker. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, regulating my breathing just as I would before stepping out of a Black Hawk helicopter into a hot zone. Eleanor Arthur's voice was thin, coated in that nervous, placating tone he always used when Margaret was standing close by, dictating his words. You received the invitation. Chloe really wants you there. It's her big day, kiddo. The Prescott family is very traditional. We just need everything to look perfect. Please, just come, sit quietly, and smile. He didn't ask about my recent deployment. He didn't ask if the shrapnel scar on my shoulder was aching in the cold dampness of the North Carolina autumn. He just delivered his orders, wrapped in the guise of paternal affection. He needed a prop to prove to Chloe's wealthy future in-laws that we were a happy, unified family. I closed my eyes, picturing the terrified 19-year-old privates I had patched up in the dirt. You do not abandon a hostile zone just because the odds are bad. You go in, assess the threat, and hold your ground. I packed my duffel bag with surgical precision, placing my pressed dress uniform carefully on top. 2 days later, I stood in the opulent, dimly lit lounge of a country club in Virginia for the rehearsal dinner. I wore a simple, tailored navy dress, keeping my posture rigidly straight. I deliberately positioned myself near a towering, floral arrangement, observing the room with a tactical eye. That was when I heard it. I don't know how Chloe deals with the stress. A voice murmured from the terrace door. It was one of the groomsmen, swirling whiskey in a crystal glass. He was speaking to Julian Prescott, the groom. Julian was a tall, sharp-eyed man in his early 30s, a successful attorney known for his pro bono work with veterans. Her stepsister is just deeply unstable, the groomsman continued, lowering his voice. Chloe told us she's been in and out of psychiatric care for years. Severe personality disorders, violent PTSD, apparently. The family has to hide her away just to keep everyone safe. It's a tragedy, really, but Chloe is such a saint for putting up with it. My spine turned to iron. The air left my lungs. Chloe hadn't just erased me. She had weaponized my military service. She had taken the uniform I bled for. The psychological fortitude I had to prove to the Department of Defense every 6 months, and twisted it into a disgusting, fabricated stigma to ensure I remained invisible. Julian didn't laugh or agree. Instead, his brow furrowed. He looked past the groomsmen and his eyes locked onto me across the room. He didn't see a trembling, unhinged woman. He saw a woman standing at parade rest, her eyes flat, calculating, and entirely sane. Julian politely excused himself and walked directly toward me. "You must be Eleanor," Julian said, his voice deep and measuring. He extended a hand, "Chloe's sister, stepsister." I corrected smoothly, my grip firm and unwavering. "And yes, it's a pleasure." Julian, he studied my face, then glanced down at the garment bag resting against my chair. The edge of a protective plastic cover was unzipped just enough to reveal the dark blue fabric of an army dress uniform, and the unmistakable metallic glint of a purple heart ribbon pinned above the breast pocket. Julian was a lawyer who spent half his week cross-examining witnesses and digging through federal records. I watched the gears turning behind his dark eyes. The narrative he had been fed by his grieving, supposedly victimized bride was suddenly colliding violently with the tangible reality standing right in front of him. "Your active duty," Julian stated softly, not as a question, but as a realization. "Captain, Medical Corps," I replied, my voice a quiet, impenetrable fortress. I believe Chloe might have left that detail out. Julian didn't say another word, but the subtle tightening of his jaw told me everything I needed to know. The seed of doubt wasn't just planted. It had already taken root. The wedding reception was a suffocating display of wealth. 200 of Virginia's elite were packed into a grand ballroom, dripping with Swarovski crystals and white roses. A string quartet played softly in the corner, entirely drowned out by the clinking of champagne flutes and the hollow laughter of people who only cared about their social standing. I was assigned to table 24, shoved into the darkest corner of the room, directly adjacent to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed past, a gust of greasy, heated air hit the back of my neck. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on my lap, untouchable in my quiet dignity. The room fell silent as Chloe took the stage. She was a vision in a $15,000 custom gown, her smile wide and practiced. She gripped the microphone and launched into a tear-jerking, saccharine speech. She thanked her mother, Margaret, for her endless sacrifices. She thanked my father, Arthur, for being her rock. She thanked the florists, the wedding planner, and the Prescott family for welcoming her into their legacy. Then her eyes flicked across the room, bypassing the wealthy guests, and locking on to the dark corner where I sat. Her sweet smile morphed into a mask of tragic, manufactured sorrow. "I also want to acknowledge my stepsister, Eleanor, who is here tonight," Chloe said, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. "It has been a heartbreaking journey for our family, dealing with Eleanor's severe mental health struggles. It takes a toll, loving someone who is so broken, someone who requires so much hiding and protection." She paused, letting a single tear fall perfectly down her contoured cheek. "But we are a family. And even though she's nothing without us, we will always be her caretakers." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, heavy, and toxic. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I looked directly at my father, who was staring at his plate, sweating, choosing once again to let me be slaughtered for his own peace. Then, the scrape of a wooden chair against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. Julian Prescott stood up from the sweetheart table, His face was devoid of the joy a groom should possess. He looked cold, clinical, and furious. He walked up the steps to the stage, gently but firmly prying the microphone from Chloe's manicured hands. Chloe looked at him, her eyes wide, expecting him to defend her martyrdom. My bride just told you that her stepsister is a fragile, unstable burden. Julian's voice boomed across the room, devoid of any warmth. What she conveniently left out is that Captain Eleanor Vance is an active duty combat medic in the United States Special Forces. She has passed every stringent psychological evaluation the Pentagon requires to save lives under hostile fire. The crowd gasped. Chloe's face drained of color, turning the shade of ash. But that is not the worst part, Julian continued. Reaching inside his tailored tuxedo jacket, he pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers. Last night, after noticing a few inconsistencies, I utilized my firm's resources. I discovered that for the last 4 years, Chloe and her mother have been committing federal mail fraud. Margaret, seated at the VIP table, physically recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth. They have been intercepting letters from the families of soldiers Eleanor saved, as well as official military commendations, to keep her isolated and convinced she had no support system, Julian stated, holding the papers up for the front rows to see. Furthermore, I found drafted legal documents on my fiancé's computer. They were attempting to use this fabricated narrative of insanity to establish a psychiatric conservatorship over Eleanor, with the sole intent of seizing the trust fund left by Eleanor's late biological mother. Pandemonium erupted. Julian's parents stood up instantly, their faces masks of pure, aristocratic horror. Chloe scrambled toward Julian, grabbing his sleeve, her acrylic nails digging into the fabric. She was sobbing now, ugly, jagged, panicked noises. Julian, please. You don't understand. She's crazy. I was protecting us. Julian looked down at her hand as if it were a venomous snake. He pulled his arm away sharply. True compassion isn't destroying an innocent woman to inflate your own ego. Chloe, you didn't just lie to me about a hero. You tried to steal her basic human rights. There is no marriage here. My lawyers will contact you on Monday morning. Julian dropped the microphone onto the podium. It let out a harsh electronic squeal that made the guests wince. He walked down the stairs, bypassed the hysterical bride, and strode straight out of the ballroom, followed closely by his horrified family. Through the chaos, Arthur broke away from his sobbing wife and ran toward my table. He was sweating profusely. His tuxedo rumpled. He reached out, his hands trembling. Eleanor, sweetie, I swear to God I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about the legal documents. You have to believe me. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I looked at the man who had contributed half my DNA. He looked small and pathetic. You didn't know about the documents, Arthur, because you never wanted to know anything that required you to be a man, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the noise like a scalpel. You let them strip me of my dignity because it was easier for you. You are not a victim. You are an accomplice. I stepped around him, leaving him weeping beside the kitchen doors. As I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, the remaining guests parted for me in absolute, stunned silence. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the crisp, honest November air. I took a deep breath, the cold filling my lungs. Clean and pure, the water was finally over. And for the first time in 19 years, I was completely, unapologetically free. The drive back to Fort Bragg was a 3-hour stretch of dark asphalt and silent pine trees. But for the first time in my life, the silence inside my vehicle did not feel heavy. It felt like oxygen. I rolled the window of my battered Jeep halfway down, letting the freezing November wind rush through the cabin. It whipped across my face, carrying the raw, honest scent of damp earth and dying leaves, a sharp contrast to the suffocating cloud of designer perfumes and manufactured joy I had just left behind in that Virginia ballroom. The radio remained off. I did not need music or distraction. My mind was entirely occupied by the profound, structural shift that had just occurred in my universe. The invisible chains that had tethered my self-worth to a family incapable of loving me had been severed completely. I was a phantom no longer. By Monday morning, the fallout was absolute and merciless. Julian Prescott was not a man who made empty threats in the heat of the moment. As a high-powered attorney with deep connections to veteran advocacy groups and federal law enforcement, his strike was swift, surgical, and devastating. The news did not filter down to me through family gossip. It came via an official phone call from the Judge Advocate General's office. Julian had immediately submitted the drafted conservatorship documents and the evidence of the intercepted federal mail to the authorities. Tampering with the United States mail is a federal offense. Intercepting official military commendations and letters from the families of wounded service members elevates that offense to an entirely different level of legal peril. Margaret and Chloe were completely obliterated, both legally and socially. The Prescott family, a pillar of the Virginia elite, excommunicated them with brutal efficiency. Within 48 hours, the country club memberships were revoked, the social invitations vanished, and the meticulously crafted facade of the perfect, wealthy family crumbled into ash. Chloe, who had spent her entire existence terrified of being anything less than the center of a glamorous universe, found herself staring down the barrel of federal fraud investigations. The irony was not lost on me. The woman who had tried to build a psychiatric cage for me had effectively built a federal one for herself. My father, Arthur, attempted to contact me 17 times that week. He left voicemails that grew increasingly desperate, weeping into the receiver, begging for an opportunity to explain his profound ignorance. He claimed he was a victim of Margaret's manipulation, that he was simply a bystander who had been kept in the dark. I listened to exactly one of those voicemails before deleting it and blocking his number permanently. A bystander who watches a child be emotionally systematically dismantled for 2 decades is not a victim. He is an accomplice who chose his own comfort over his daughter's basic human rights. I felt no pity for him as he sat in the ruins of the marriage he had sacrificed me to maintain. Back at the forward operating base, my life resumed its demanding, vital rhythm. I was running a mass casualty simulation drill on Thursday afternoon, my boots coated in red Carolina mud, my hands moving automatically to apply a tourniquet to a training mannequin. The chaos of the drill, the shouting, the simulated smoke, the urgency was my sanctuary. This was a world built on absolute truth. In the medical tent, there was no room for gaslighting or manipulation. A wound was either bleeding or it was contained. A soldier was either breathing or they were not. Here my existence mattered, not as a prop for a family portrait, but as the literal barrier between life and death for the men and women under my care, Major Sarah Jones. My commanding officer and the woman who had mentored me through my darkest early days in the military, found me washing the fake blood from my hands at the outdoor sinks. She was a hardened veteran with piercing eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She stood beside me, turning on the adjacent faucet, letting the cold water run over her own hands. She didn't ask about the wedding. The military grapevine was incredibly efficient. She already knew the broad strokes of what had transpired. "You look different, Captain Vance," Major Jones said quietly, her voice carrying over the hum of the base generators. "I feel different, ma'am," I replied, drying my hands on a rough paper towel. "Lighter. The heaviest things a soldier ever carries isn't their rucksack," she noted, turning off the tap and looking at me directly. "It's the expectations of people who don't respect them. You held the line out there, Eleanor. You enforced the perimeter of your own dignity. I've seen soldiers survive combat only to let their toxic families destroy them from the inside out. I am profoundly proud of you for walking away." I looked at Major Jones, realizing in that moment that she, along with the soldiers I served beside, was my actual family. Family is not determined by an accident of biology or a shared surname. True family is an ecosystem of mutual respect, equality, and unwavering support. They do not demand that you shrink so they can feel large. They demand that you stand tall. And they stand shoulder to shoulder with you when the fire comes. 3 weeks after the shattered wedding reception, the winter cold had firmly settled over North Carolina. I was sitting in a quiet, independently owned coffee shop just off the base, reviewing medical supply manifests on my tablet, when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up to see Julian Prescott stepping out of the freezing wind. He wore a dark, heavy wool overcoat. His expressions serious but significantly less burdened than the last time I had seen him. We had arranged this meeting a few days prior. It was not a social call, nor was it the beginning of a romantic trope. It was a meeting between two professionals who had inadvertently saved each other from different kinds of prisons. Julian spotted me in the corner booth and walked over, sliding into the seat opposite mine. He ordered a black coffee from the waitress before setting a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto the wooden table between us. "Captain Vance," Julian greeted, his voice respectful and calm. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know your time off base is limited." "Julian," I nodded, setting my tablet aside. "I appreciate you making the drive down from Virginia. How are the legal proceedings advancing?" "Aggressively," Julian replied, a brief, sharp smile touching his lips. "Margaret and Chloe are currently attempting to turn on each other to secure a lighter plea deal regarding the mail fraud charges. It is as ugly and pathetic as you might imagine. Your father has filed for divorce, though his own financial complicity is currently under the microscope. But I didn't come here to discuss their demise. I came here to return what belongs to you." Julian unzipped the portfolio and carefully withdrew a stack of letters. They were bound together with a simple rubber band. Some of the envelopes were slightly wrinkled. Others bore the return addresses of small towns across the country. He pushed the stack across the table toward me. "When the federal investigators executed the search warrant on Margaret's home office, they recovered these," Julian explained, his voice softening. "They were hidden in a locked filing cabinet. They have been processed as evidence. But the prosecutor released copies of the contents to me so I could deliver them to you. They are the letters from the families of the soldiers you saved during your second deployment." I stared at the stack of envelopes. My chest tightened, an unfamiliar pressure building behind my ribs. For years, I had believed that the grueling, horrific days spent pulling broken bodies from burning Humvees had gone entirely unnoticed by the civilian world. I had done my duty without expectation of gratitude, but the utter silence had always been a quiet, lingering ache. I reached out, my fingers tracing the handwriting on the top envelope. "They tried to make you invisible, Eleanor, because your light was exposing the absolute emptiness of their own lives," Julian said quietly, watching me. "I spent my entire career defending human rights in the courtroom. I fight for equality, for the belief that every person deserves to have their truth heard and their dignity protected. I was blind to the profound violation of those rights happening in my own relationship. Chloe didn't just lie to me. She attempted to violate your fundamental right to self-determination. She tried to legally erase your autonomy for her own financial gain. Gaslighting is a highly effective weapon." "Julian," I said, finally looking up from the letters to meet his gaze. "It relies on the victim's inherent goodness, their willingness to compromise, their desire for peace. Toxic families weaponize our empathy against us. You shouldn't blame yourself for believing her initially. You should be proud that, when confronted with the truth, you didn't hesitate to stand on the right side of it. You are an incredibly formidable woman, Eleanor," Julian said, his respect evident and absolute. "Your resilience is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. I am deeply sorry for the role my wedding played in your trauma, but I am profoundly grateful that it finally brought their cruelty to the light." "Don't be sorry," I told him honestly. "That wedding was the catalyst I needed to stop negotiating with my abusers. It was a necessary destruction." We finished our coffee in comfortable, companionable silence, discussing veteran affairs and the structural changes needed in the military healthcare system. When Julian finally stood to leave, we shook hands, affirm. Equal grip that spoke of a shared understanding and a closed chapter. That evening, I sat on my cot in the barracks, the only sound the distant hum of a Black Hawk helicopter running drills in the night sky. I opened the letters one by one. I read the words of a mother in Ohio who thanked me for giving her son back to her. I read the messy, crayon-drawn card from a little girl in Texas who thanked me for saving her father's legs. I read the official commendation from a general praising my unwavering composure under fire. The tears that finally fell were not born of grief, nor were they shed for the family I had lost. They were tears of profound, overwhelming validation. The ultimate human right is the right to define your own reality, to own your achievements, and to dictate your own worth. For 19 years, I had allowed cowards to write my story. As I carefully placed the letters into my footlocker alongside my Purple Heart, I knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever hold the pen to my life again. I was a healer. I was a soldier. I was visible. And I was entirely whole. 6 months after the disastrous wedding reception in Virginia, the harsh winter melted into a vibrant, humid springs across the sprawling expanse of Fort Bragg. The North Carolina air grew thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a familiar, grounding perfume that signaled a season of renewal. For the first time in 28 years, the changing of the seasons mirrored the profound internal shift within my own life. The relentless, exhausting weight of constantly anticipating the next emotional ambush from my family had completely vanished. In its place was a vast, unencumbered mental landscape. I was no longer spending my emotional currency trying to prove my worth to a father who refused to see me, or a stepmother and stepsister who actively conspired to erase me. I was simply Captain Eleanor Vance, an officer, a healer, and a woman who had successfully defended the perimeter of her own soul. The military base was an ecosystem of predictable rhythms and absolute accountability, a stark contrast to the shifting, manipulative realities Margaret and Chloe had constantly tried to construct. One Tuesday afternoon, after finishing a grueling 12-hour shift at the base hospital, I found a heavy, cream-colored envelope waiting in my secure mailbox. For a fleeting second, my pulse spiked, a residual trauma response expecting another gold-foiled insult from my past. But as I flipped the envelope over, I saw the elegant, embossed crest of the Prescott Foundation. It was from Julian's parents, William and Beatrice Prescott. The handwriting on the front was not the sharp, pretentious calligraphy Chloe had favored, but the steady, practical script of a woman who managed a multi-million-dollar philanthropic empire. I slid my thumb under the seal and opened the letter as I walked toward my barracks. The letter was a formal invitation, but the handwritten note at the bottom was deeply personal. Beatrice Prescott was inviting me to Washington, D.C., as the guest of honor for their foundation's annual gala, which was dedicating its entirely newly restructured endowment to veteran medical care and combat trauma recovery. Eleanor, Beatrice had written in deep blue ink, our family was nearly complicit in the silencing of a remarkable woman. Chloe attempted to use our name and our resources to violate your fundamental human rights. We cannot undo the cruelty you endured at that rehearsal dinner, but we can ensure that your dedication to saving lives is recognized, funded, and celebrated. Please allow us the honor of standing beside you in the light. I sat on the edge of my cot, staring at the heavy paper. The irony was poetic and absolute. Chloe had spent her entire adult life, and hundreds of thousands of my father's dollars, meticulously curating a persona to impress families like the Prescotts. She had believed that true power lay in the brand of a dress, the size of a diamond, and the deliberate destruction of anyone who threatened her spotlight. Yet, the very people she had worshipped were now reaching out to the woman she had banished to the kitchen doors. They were not reaching out of pity. They were reaching out because they recognized something that toxic people are fundamentally incapable of understanding: genuine character. Wealth and status are easily lost, as Chloe had brutally discovered, but integrity, forged in the fires of adversity and service, is entirely untouchable. A few weeks later, I traveled to Washington, D.C., to meet with the Foundation's board of directors. Sitting in the sunlit, mahogany-paneled boardroom, I was not intimidated. I presented them with a comprehensive, data-driven proposal for upgrading the portable surgical kits used by forward-operating medical teams. Beatrice Prescott, a fiercely intelligent woman with silver hair and warm, assessing eyes, listened to every word with rapt attention. She did not interrupt. She did not attempt to talk over me. She treated me with the profound equality and respect that should be the absolute baseline for all human interaction. When the meeting concluded, the board unanimously approved a grant that would fully equip 3 entire combat medical battalions with state-of-the-art trauma gear. As I shook Beatrice's hand, I felt the final, lingering shadows of the insanity label Chloe had tried to pin on me evaporate. Healing is not just the absence of pain. It is the active construction of a life so magnificent and purposeful that the lies of your abusers simply cannot survive in the same atmosphere. The evening of the Prescott Foundation Gala arrived with a crisp, clear sky over the nation's capital. The venue was a historic ballroom lined with massive marble columns and illuminated by cascading crystal chandeliers. A setting remarkably similar to the one where I had been publicly humiliated 6 months prior. But the context had changed the very atomic structure of the room. I was not wearing a plain civilian dress designed to make me blend into the wallpaper. I was wearing my formal army dress uniform, the brass buttons polished to a high mirror shine, the purple heart ribbon resting securely over my left breast. As I walked through the grand double doors, there was no table hidden behind swinging kitchen doors waiting for me. Instead, Julian Prescott stood near the entrance, holding a glass of sparkling water. When he saw me, he smiled, a genuine, respectful expression between two people who had weathered a storm and emerged entirely intact. The gala was attended by senators, military generals, and the highest echelons of East Coast society. Throughout the cocktail hour, I engaged in conversations about healthcare policy, trauma recovery, and the logistical challenges of treating wounded soldiers in active combat zones. People listened. They asked insightful questions. They looked me in the eye. I was not the tragic, broken stepsister they had to whisper about in the corners. I was an authority, a leader, and a survivor. When it was time for the keynote address, Beatrice Prescott took the stage. She spoke passionately about the Foundation's new direction, but her most poignant words were reserved for the concept of truth. She spoke about how easily the truth can be obscured by those who crave power over others, and how the ultimate defense against manipulation is the unyielding documentation of one's own character. Then, Beatrice introduced me. As my name echoed through the sound system, the applause began. It was not the pitying, hesitant clapping of people observing a spectacle. It was a thunderous, standing ovation from 300 people who understood the gravity of service and the absolute necessity of defending human dignity. I walked up the steps to the podium. The microphone felt cool and solid under my fingers. I looked out over the sea of faces, and my mind briefly flashed back to Chloe's face, twisted in rage, screaming that I was nothing without them. I took a deep, steadying breath, my voice echoing clearly across the expansive room. For a very long time, I was told that my worth was conditional. I began, the words carrying the weight of decades of silent endurance. I was taught that to be loved by my family, I had to be small. I had to be quiet. I had to accept a narrative that stripped me of my sanity and my humanity, so that someone else could feel secure in their own fragility. But true security, true strength, is never built on the subjugation of another human being. Equality is not a privilege. It is a fundamental human right. Respect is not something you beg for at the back table. It is the absolute minimum requirement for anyone who wishes to sit beside you. I paused, looking directly at Julian and Beatrice, who were watching with profound pride. The greatest act of rebellion against those who seek to destroy you is simply to survive and thrive in the absolute truth of who you are. We heal not by seeking revenge, but by reclaiming our energy. setting brutal and necessary boundaries, and investing our lives into the people and the causes that actually matter. I am Captain Eleanor Vance. I am a combat medic. I am a woman who has held the line between life and death. And I stand here tonight to tell you that no one, absolutely, no one has the power to write your story unless you hand them the pen. The room erupted into applause once more. A wall of sound that vibrated through the floorboards. But this time, I didn't just endure the noise. I absorbed it. I owned it. Later that night, returning to my hotel room overlooking the illuminated monuments of the city, I unpinned the medals from my uniform. The war against my family was a distant memory, a closed file. I had not just survived their cruelty, I had transmuted it into a foundation of absolute, unshakable strength. I was a soldier. I was a healer. And in the quiet sanctuary of my own mind, I was completely and permanently free. The federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, possessed a cold, imposing architecture that felt entirely appropriate for the final dismantling of an empire built on lies. 9 months had passed since the catastrophic wedding reception that had irreversibly altered the trajectory of my life. I walked through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom wearing my class address uniform, the brass insignia catching the muted light filtering through the high, arched windows. I was not there to gloat, nor was I there to seek revenge. I was there to fulfill my duty as a witness for the federal prosecution. The United States government had indicted my stepmother, Margaret, and my stepsister, Chloe, on multiple felony charges, including federal mail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The conservatorship documents Julian had uncovered were the final nails in a coffin they had meticulously built for themselves. As I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, the ambient murmur of the courtroom felt distant, like the hum of a helicopter rotor miles away. I maintained a posture of absolute stillness, a discipline forged in combat zones where showing fear could cost you your life. When the bailiff announced the judge's arrival, the room rose in unison. Margaret and Chloe were escorted into the courtroom through the side doors by two federal marshals. The physical transformation in both women was staggering. The polished, unassailable veneer of extreme wealth had been completely stripped away. Chloe, who had once worn a $15,000 custom wedding gown and a diamond tiara, was now dressed in a shapeless, drab olive jumpsuit, her wrists secured in steel handcuffs. The meticulously contoured makeup and expensive hair extensions were gone, leaving behind a hollow, terrified young woman whose eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. Margaret looked equally devastated. Her posture slumped, the arrogant tilt of her chin replaced by the trembling reality of impending incarceration. I watched them take their seats at the defense table. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I only felt a profound, clinical emptiness. They had spent 2 decades trying to make me invisible. Yet here they were, entirely exposed to the unblinking, unforgiving scrutiny of the federal justice system. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp, unyielding woman with decades of experience, laid out the timeline of their crimes with devastating precision. She presented the intercepted military commendations, the letters from grieving families that had been hidden in a locked filing cabinet, and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluations Chloe had attempted to submit to the courts. It was a masterclass in establishing intent. When the time came for victim impact statements, I stood up and walked toward the podium. I did not look at Margaret or Chloe. I looked directly at the federal judge. I spoke about the sanctity of the military mail system, about the lifeline it provides to soldiers operating in the darkest corners of the world. I explained that stealing those letters was not merely a theft of paper. It was the theft of honor, the theft of closure for grieving mothers, and a direct assault on the psychological survival of an active duty service member. I stated clearly that the defendants had weaponized the concept of mental health, attempting to use the devastating reality of PTSD as a convenient tool for financial theft. Your Honor, I concluded, my voice steady and echoing clearly across the silent courtroom. The defendants attempted to legally erase my autonomy because my existence threatened their curated narrative of superiority. They believed that, because I did not fight their emotional abuse at home, I would not fight for my fundamental human rights. They were mistaken. I do not ask for vengeance. I simply ask that the court hold them accountable for attempting to dismantle a life that was pledged to the service of this country. As I returned to my seat, I caught sight of Arthur sitting in the back row. My father looked broken, a sobbing, pathetic shell of a man who had lost everything because he refused to stand up for anything. I did not break my stride. I did not offer him a glance. When the judge handed down the sentences, 72 months in federal prison for Margaret and 48 months for Chloe, alongside massive financial restitution, the gavel struck the sounding block with absolute finality. The echo signaled the permanent end of my past. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Virginia sunlight, leaving the ghosts of my childhood locked in the dark where they belonged. The searing heat of the Syrian desert was a brutal, physical force, but it was a heat I understood completely. 6 months after the sentencing hearing in Virginia, I was deployed to a forward operating base near the Euphrates River. The air tasted of fine sand, diesel exhaust, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. I stood inside the reinforced walls of the primary medical tent, wiping a layer of grit from my brow. The base was a symphony of organized chaos, a stark contrast to the sterile, quiet halls of the federal courthouse. But this was my domain. This was the crucible where titles like captain were not merely worn on a collar, but proven in the blood and dust of the trauma bay. Stacked neatly along the reinforced walls of the tent were dozens of heavy-duty, waterproof Pelican cases. They bore the discreet, stenciled logo of the Prescott Foundation. Beatrice and Julian Prescott had kept their promise. The grant we had secured in Washington, D.C., had provided our unit with the most advanced portable surgical equipment available, transforming our capabilities from rudimentary stabilization to advanced, life-saving field surgery. The radio on my tactical vest crackled to life, cutting through the ambient hum of the generators. Medevac inbound. ETA 4 minutes. We have 3 urgent surgical casualties. IED blast. Prepare for massive hemorrhage protocols. The voice of the operations officer was flat, professional, and urgent. I instantly shifted into the hyper-focused, emotional void that trauma medicine requires. I barked orders to my team of medics, and within seconds, the tent was prepped. We cracked the seals on the new Prescott Foundation trauma kits. Inside were advanced hemostatic agents, portable ultrasound devices, and rapid blood transfusion infusers that we had desperately needed during previous deployments. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the Black Hawk helicopter's rotors began to vibrate in my chest, growing louder until the downdraft violently shook the canvas walls of the tent. I pulled on my sterile gloves. The snap of the latex sharp in the tense silence before the doors opened. The medics rushed through the flap doors, carrying the stretchers. The smell of burned cordite, charred fabric, and copper flooded the enclosed space. The first soldier was unconscious, his lower extremities severely compromised by shrapnel, arterial bleed, right femoral. A corporal shouted, his hands slick with crimson. I moved seamlessly to the head of the stretcher. Using the new portable ultrasound equipment, I rapidly identified the internal bleeding source while simultaneously guiding another medic to apply the advanced hemostatic combat gauze from our new kits. We stabilized his airway, established 2 large bore IV lines, and initiated a rapid blood transfusion using the pressurized infusers. The technology provided by the Foundation was flawlessly efficient, shaving critical, life or death minutes off our response time. For 2 grueling hours, my team and I fought a desperate, bloody war against the Reaper. We sutured, we compressed, we stabilized. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the desert sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, all 3 soldiers were stabilized and prepped for the transport flight to the major military hospital in Germany. As the roar of the departing transport plane faded into the night, I stood alone outside the medical tent, a cup of lukewarm black coffee in my hand. My uniform was stained. My muscles ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and the knuckles of my hands were raw from repeated scrubbing. But as I looked up at the vast, star-strewn canopy of the desert sky, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a brief letter I had received from Julian Prescott a week earlier, updating me on the veteran advocacy work we were continuing to build together. He was a trusted ally now, a testament to the fact that beautiful, enduring connections can grow from the ashes of toxic destruction. I smiled, tracing the edge of the paper with my thumb. The little girl who had been banished to the basement, the teenager who had been told she was invisible, and the woman who had been called a worthless burden at a wedding were all gone. In their place stood a warrior who had built her own family, defined her own worth, and turned her deepest wounds into the very armor she used to save the world. The war was over, and I had won. The return from a combat deployment never happens all at once. It is a slow, methodical recalibration of the senses, a gradual unclenching of the jaw that has been set against the constant threat of indirect fire. When the massive C-17 Globemaster finally touched down on the tarmac at Pope Field in North Carolina, the heavy vibration of the reverse thrusters, reverberating through the aluminum hull, felt like the closing of a massive, heavy door. I walked down the lowered cargo ramp into the blinding, humid sunlight of the American South, the heavy canvas of my rucksack cutting familiar grooves into my shoulders. It had been an excruciating, bloody, and ultimately triumphant 9 months in the Syrian desert. We had brought every single member of our medical battalion home alive. As I stepped onto the concrete, I did not have a biological family waiting behind the chain-link fences with brightly painted welcome signs. I did not have a father looking for my face in the crowd of desert camouflage uniforms. And for the first time in my entire existence, the absence of that biological tether did not hollow me out. It filled me with a profound, unshakable peace. 2 months after my return, the auditorium at Fort Bragg was filled to capacity. The room was a sea of crisp, impeccably pressed class address uniforms, the brass buttons and polished shoes gleaming under the bright, utilitarian overhead lights. I stood backstage, adjusting the cuffs of my own dark blue jacket, my breathing steady and controlled. I was being awarded the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service and exceptionally valorous conduct during the mass casualty event near the Euphrates River. But the medal itself was secondary to the people sitting in the front row of the auditorium. Major Sarah Jones sat at attention, her chest covered in her own hard-earned ribbons, her eyes shining with fierce, maternal pride. Next to her sat Julian Prescott and his mother, Beatrice. They had flown down from Virginia specifically for this ceremony. They were not there out of obligation, nor were they there to maintain a social facade. They were there because they were my chosen family, an alliance forged in the crucible of truth and cemented by mutual, unwavering respect. When my name was called, I marched across the polished wooden stage. The commanding general read the official citation, detailing the precise timeline of the medical interventions, the successful utilization of the Prescott Foundation trauma kits, and the lives that were pulled back from the brink of death. As the general pinned the heavy bronze medal above my left breast pocket and offered a sharp, crisp salute, the auditorium erupted in applause. I looked down at the front row. Julian was standing, clapping with genuine, quiet respect. Beatrice offered a warm, dignified nod. This applause was the absolute antithesis of the mocking, manufactured spectacle at Chloe's wedding. This was the sound of true visibility. It was the sound of a community acknowledging my reality, my sacrifice, and my intrinsic worth. I returned the general's salute, my hand perfectly straight, my eyes completely clear. I was exactly where I was meant to be, surrounded by the people who had earned the right to share my space. Later that afternoon, as I was clearing out my mail slot at the battalion headquarters, I found a thin, white envelope mixed in with the medical supply catalogs and official memorandums. The return address was a post office box in a small, rundown town in Western Virginia. I recognized the shaky, downward slanting handwriting immediately. It was from Arthur. It had been over a year since he had watched me walk out of the ballroom. Over a year since his wife and stepdaughter were federally indicted. I stood in the quiet hallway of the administrative building, holding the envelope between my thumb and index finger. In the past, holding a letter from my father would have triggered a cascade of anxiety, a desperate hope for validation mixed with the agonizing certainty of disappointment. Now, I scanned my internal emotional landscape and found absolutely nothing. There was no anger. There was no grief. There was only the clinical, detached observation of an artifact from a lifetime that no longer belonged to me. Healing is often misunderstood as a dramatic, tear-filled confrontation. But the ultimate pinnacle of recovery is simply apathy. It is the moment when the people who broke you no longer possess the gravitational pull to affect your emotional tides. Arthur had made his choices. He had chosen cowardice over his daughter, and he was currently serving a life sentence inside the prison of his own consequences. I did not need to read his apologies, nor did I need to grant him absolution to secure my own peace. Without opening the envelope, without a single hesitation or second thought, I dropped the letter into the industrial shredder sitting next to the mailboxes. The machine hummed to life, its steel blades effortlessly destroying the paper in a matter of seconds. I turned on my heel and walked out the door into the bright afternoon sun, heading toward the officers' club to celebrate with my real family. The culmination of our shared battle against the shadows of trauma did not occur in a courtroom, nor did it happen on a military base. It materialized exactly 2 years after the wedding, in the form of a sprawling, state-of-the-art architectural marvel nestled in the quiet, rolling green hills of the Shenandoah Valley. The building was constructed entirely of glass, pale oak, and natural stone, designed specifically to capture maximum sunlight and eradicate any sensation of confinement or darkness. This was the newly completed Prescott Vance Center for Veteran Rehabilitation. It was a facility dedicated not only to the physical recovery of wounded combat veterans, but to the intense, complex psychological rebuilding of soldiers who had lost their sense of identity in the fog of war. Julian and Beatrice had utilized the full, formidable weight of their foundation's endowment to build it, but they had insisted that I serve as the co-director of the medical advisory board, ensuring that the facility was grounded in the gritty, realistic needs of the men and women it aimed to serve. The grand opening ceremony was a quiet, dignified affair, completely devoid of the ostentatious, ego-driven pageantry that had defined my stepfamily's existence. There were no crystal chandeliers or expensive, imported white roses. Instead, there were physical therapy rooms overlooking the tranquil mountains, collaborative healing spaces, and a staff composed entirely of trauma-informed specialists. I stood at the podium in the main atrium, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the warm air. Julian stood to my left, leaning comfortably against the polished oak railing, listening with the quiet intensity of a man who truly valued the voice of the woman speaking. I looked out at the small crowd of doctors, veterans, and Foundation board members. This was the physical manifestation of my entire journey, the tangible proof that our deepest wounds can be repurposed into the very tools we use to heal the world. When we experience profound betrayal, especially from the people who are biologically mandated to protect us, the instinct is to make ourselves small. I told the assembled crowd, my voice echoing clearly through the bright, open space. We are told, often implicitly, that our pain is an inconvenience, that our truth is a burden, and that we are nothing without the very systems that are slowly destroying us. But the men and women who will walk through the doors of this center have already learned the hardest lesson of survival. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. You must establish a perimeter. You must defend your borders. You must realize that setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. It is a fundamental human right. It is the absolute prerequisite for equality, dignity, and recovery. I paused, letting the words settle into the quiet room. I thought about the 9-year-old girl who had been banished to a damp, dark basement. I thought about the combat medic who had been called an unstable failure, and I looked at the powerful, fiercely independent woman standing in the sunlight, commanding the room with absolute authority. We built this center to remind our veterans that they are not invisible. Their sacrifices are cataloged, their pain is validated, and their futures are entirely their own to construct. We do not demand that they smile to make us comfortable. We demand that they stand in their truth, however jagged and uncomfortable it may be. Because it is only in the light of the absolute truth that the shadows of the past finally lose their power. When the ribbon was cut and the ceremony concluded, the crowd dispersed to tour the new facility. Julian walked over to me, holding 2 cups of black coffee. He handed one to me, the warmth of the cardboard seeping comfortably into my palms. We walked together out onto the wide, wooden observation deck that overlooked the sweeping valley below. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the distant mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. It was a beautiful, expansive world, utterly devoid of the petty, suffocating cruelties that had once defined my horizon. "You built an incredible sanctuary here, Eleanor," Julian said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You took the worst day of your life and turned it into an institution that will save thousands. We built it." "Julian," I corrected him softly, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "It takes an alliance to change the world. It takes people who are willing to look at the wreckage, refuse the convenient lies, and choose the heavy, difficult truth." I leaned against the wooden railing, feeling the solid wood beneath my hands, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heart. The echoes of Chloe's voice screaming that I was nothing without them had been entirely erased, replaced by the wind moving through the Shenandoah pines. They had tried to bury me beneath their insecurities, their greed, and their profound cowardice. But they had failed to realize one fundamental, undeniable truth. They had not buried a victim. They had planted a seed. I was Captain Eleanor Vance. I was a survivor, a protector, and a healer. And as I looked out over the vast, sunlit valley that stretched endlessly before me, I knew that my life was not just beginning. It had finally, beautifully, and permanently arrived. As the dust settles on this story, let's take a quiet moment to unpack the heavy, unspoken truths we just witnessed. Society spends a lot of time conditioning us to believe that blood is thicker than water, that family is a permanent contract we are forced to honor, no matter how much it costs our own soul. But Eleanor's journey teaches us something profoundly different. Her stepfamily took her greatest achievements, her strength, and her resilience, and they twisted them into a weapon. They demanded that she shrink herself, that she play the role of the broken victim, just so they could feel powerful and charitable in front of an audience. What makes Eleanor remarkable isn't just the fact that she saved lives on the battlefield. It is her unyielding refusal to accept the false reality her abusers tried to force upon her. When the bride stood on that stage and called her nothing, Eleanor didn't shatter. Why? Because her self-worth was not rented from her father's approval or her stepsister's validation. It was built in the trenches of real life. Healing from narcissistic family dynamics rarely looks like a dramatic movie scene. More often, the ultimate victory is simply apathy. It is the quiet, beautiful realization that the people who hurt you no longer hold any power over your emotional state. It looks like walking out of a room full of people who refuse to see your value, stepping into the cold night air, and feeling completely, undeniably free. If you are currently sitting at your own table 24 right now, hidden in the shadows of someone else's ego, please hear this. Your dignity is not up for negotiation. True family is defined by mutual respect, not biological obligation. Protect your peace, draw your boundaries in iron, and never, ever apologize for walking away from tables where respect is no longer being served. This content has been researched, developed, and edited manually by us to deliver meaningful lessons.